Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and we're now going to talk about Cobra Kai. And due to the upcoming third season of the series debuting on Netflix on January the 1st, 2021, as promised, I will provide reviews of both the first and second seasons of the show prior to the release of the third season. So here now I will talk about the first season in general. There may be spoilers throughout this review, so I highly warn you now, if you haven't seen the entire series of the first season, I advise you to stop watching now, go away, catch up with the series, and then come back to this review. Now, Cobra Kai, of course, debuted way back in 2018 on the YouTube Red Premium series, and it of course continues the continuity of the Karate Kid franchise set way back in 1984. The story takes place 30 plus years after the events of the movie, focusing on the antagonist at the time of that story, Johnny Lawrence. And we see at the beginning of the story that he's very much falling from grace. He's down on his luck. He's broken down. He's an alcoholic. He's separated from his wife and his son. And it follows the plot of him trying to rebuild his life using the Cobra Kai philosophy of strike first, no mercy, strike hard. And over the course we see him build various relationships with other students who also want to integrate using the Cobra Kai philosophy in order to solve the various dilemmas going on in their life. Johnny Lawrence goes on to reignite the previous rivalry that he had with the franchise's protagonist back then in Daniel LaRusso, who we see now has kind of veered away more from his teachings into karate and is now developed into a very successful car salesman. And we see that he's very rich and very settled with his family life until he realizes the emergence of Cobra Kai, and he does everything in his power to make sure that the Cobra Kai dojo doesn't emerge again, because he fears that that philosophy is not ideal for the current generation of kids growing up in Blue Valley. So over the course of the story we see the rivalry reignites again between both Johnny and Daniel as they bring up new students in their opposing views and philosophies of karate, and the season culminates in a major confrontation between the younger students who have adopted the various lessons and philosophies of their teachers. Now I have to say, when I first saw the initial plot and concept and trailer of Cobra Kai, I was very skeptical and once again very disappointed that we were yet seeing another fan favourite franchise, and certainly for me another very iconic and integral film franchise that as a youngster growing up in the 80s yet again revived or rebooted or reimagined, trying to appeal to more younger and current audiences. Now, as I mentioned before, Karate Kid is for me one of those iconic film franchises going on the likes of your Ghostbusters, your Indiana Jones, your Rocky, your Star Wars. It was again part of that era set within the 80s that was far more built on the joy and the escapism and the naivete and the innocence of watching the underdog character constantly challenging and overcoming the odds, overcoming the adversity, overcoming his enemies and the villains. You had straightforward the good guy and the bad guy, and for me Karate Kid was a fabric of that golden age of mainstream blockbuster cinema, certainly in my eyes. So when I came across this reboot, I was very skeptical, as I mentioned before, and even more concerned when I found out that they were going to tell the perspective of the story from the supposed antagonist in Johnny Lawrence, because I felt it was following a familiar trope that we're seeing certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, where it's seemingly now, in order to please audiences, we have to turn the once villain into the hero and the once hero into the villain. It's that typical deconstructive of characters that we've seen so many times disappointingly over the years. If we look at the likes of the DCEU Superman, Zack Snyder's version, we look at even more worse so the treatment of Luke Skywalker in the Disney Star Wars trilogy, in particular The Last Jedi, and I would even go to mention to an extent the Daniel Craig version of James Bond. All three are major examples of the classic, iconic cinematic heroes that really defined an audience generation of viewers, and trying to strip them down and make them more flawed and more vulnerable in order to relate to today's audiences, but as a result you take away what's special about them in the first place. And I really felt we were going to get that again with Cobra Kai, where Johnny is the hero and Daniel is the villain. Now, I can gladly say with this show that I was pleasantly surprised and proven to be wrong, because Cobra Kai in essence is the proven example of how you treat any reboot or reimagining of a franchise. It retains all of those classical elements that fans hold so dear about the franchise. It has its heart firmly rooted in the essence and the spirit of that golden 80s era that I described before, but at the same time it retains the heart and the soul and the depth of the characters. And with so many other interpretations that seem to almost mock or want to disattach themselves away from what made the original so special, Cobra Kai goes the other way and it embraces the spirit and the tone of the original source material. It clearly plays reference and homage to what made those nostalgia beats so special, but at the same time it moves the continuity forward by introducing new characters and new stories and building a new continuity. And rather than shame what went on before, it creates a nice synergy between the old and the new, and building a nice connection that both facets, both generation of characters can move forward in a new story. And this is the right way that you reboot a classic franchise. What makes Cobra Kai also so special is that you have two great lead performances. In particular, I would say from William Zabka as Johnny Lawrence. As I mentioned before, we get to see the perspective from his point of view, and really this is that classic redemption story where we have a supposed antagonist or villain who has hit rock bottom and he's realised the error of his ways, and he gets that one last shot to redeem himself. And over the course of the story we get to emphasise with Johnny as he acknowledges where he went wrong in his life. As I mentioned before, he's separated from his wife and his son, and he uses the Cobra Kai to really make himself better and hopefully make, to an extent, the world a better place as he tries to rebuild himself. And later on he comes across a young teenager in Miguel Diaz, who we see earlier on is picked on by various other college students, and after protecting him and coming to his aid, Johnny takes Miguel under his wing and teaches him the way of Cobra Kai and shows Miguel that you can stick up for himself, but at the same time you can still be a better person. And their relationship, their bond is really the key and the foundation to not only this first season, but perhaps I would say the entire series. And it's a very much of a repeat of the same dynamic that we saw in the original franchise between Mr. Miyagi and Daniel. And it was that relationship that made the Karate Kid franchise so special. So I think William Zabka does a great performance here alongside Zolo Madeira, who plays Miguel, and I love the chemistry and the dynamic between them two. As I mentioned before, we have that synergy. We have plenty of moments where we get contrast between Johnny teaching Miguel the ways of sticking up for themselves and learning karate, but at the same time Miguel teaching Johnny the kind of modern day and the culture. We're now living in a world that's very much entrenched and motivated and manipulated by social media, and Johnny, coming from a bygone era from the 80s, has to learn to make adjustments. And there's lots of very good humour and touching moments between the two as it progresses through the story. Now, I mentioned before what was also so relieving about the show is that it still made Daniel LaRusso, who was the hero of the Karate Kid franchise, it still made him the very much charming and likeable personality that he was from the film franchise. Yes, he was veered away now from his karate teachings, and yes, he's a bit more older and a bit more wary, but again, that's sensible because that's what you would expect. You can't expect these characters to be much older and still have the same sprightliness that they would from the original film franchise. And we see Daniel now, despite the fact that he's a very successful car salesman and he's got his wife and his daughter, he still fondly remembers and has a very big reference to all of the teachings and the ways that he was taught under Mr. Miyagi. And throughout this season we get full of lovely, touching and very sad for me moments where we get the flashback scenes, where we get the previous clips of the original trilogy, where we get those back and forth between him and Mr. Miyagi. As I mentioned before, that's what made that film franchise so special. But these scenes aren't treated as fan service. As I mentioned before, what makes Cobra Kai so special is that it has a right respect for the original source material, and every time we get a flashback between Daniel and Mr. Miyagi, it's really more of an organic way of trying to develop more, showing Daniel how, despite his very high status and his success, he hasn't forgot the ways, he hasn't forgot what Mr. Miyagi taught him, not just about karate, but how he can build a better life, about establishing balance. And he uses those again to combat Cobra Kai, because he deems Cobra Kai is a bad influence on kids and it's not the right way. It just teaches them to be bullies and much more focused on treating people in the wrong way, and he wants to combat it, and that's the strength of what we see, the conflict in between the two. So that completely works, and like I said, really carries on the DNA and the structure of what we saw from the original film franchise. Now, as I mentioned before, what Cobra Kai also did well was to introduce new and fresh and younger characters that a younger audience who hasn't seen the movies could really attach to and bind themselves forward to the story. So we have Sam, who is Daniel's daughter, and she's very a sweet-natured personality. Yes, we have the typical traits of her going out with her friends and partying and getting into trouble somewhat, but for the most part, Sam is very much of a likeable, good-hearted character, and we see over the course of the season that she builds a romantic relationship with Miguel. We have Hawk, who is one of very several characters who we see is very much victimized and bullied. Hawk, in his situation, has a slight disfigurement on his lip, and he's a very shy and very type of nerdy character, and he wants to use Cobra Kai to kind of build his inner strength and learn to stick up for himself. This is also the case for Aisha Robinson, who herself is also bullied on social media because of her large size, and once again she too wants to learn to stick up for herself and combat the bullies who are victimizing her on social media. We also have Robbie Keane, who, as I mentioned before, is the son of Johnny Lawrence, and we see him in the beginning that he's very much of a delinquent and he goes around robbing places, but after encountering Daniel and really responding to how well Daniel treats him and gives him an opportunity to work in his car business, Robbie himself sees the error of his own ways and he looks to redeem himself and go on the right and better path for himself. And over the course of the story, just like Miguel with Johnny Lawrence, we see him form a good bond and relationship with Daniel as well, and that builds over the course of the story. And then we see in a culmination of the first season how we see a potential and eventual conflict between Robbie and Miguel. So again, Cobra Kai hits on all of those familiar beats from the original, where we root for the underdog, we empathise for them, we see that they're bullied and facing heavy adversity and heavy odds, and we see their initial struggle and we sympathise with those characters, and we also see how they learn different skills, learn to stick up for themselves and look to overcome the odds and look to overcome the adversity. And that's such an important fabric of any part of growing up. And again, this is something that, as I alluded to before, what was so special about that classic 80s era of movies and entertainment, and Karate Kid was really a fabric of that, and they've continued that onto the series. If there are any slight flaws, I would say maybe sometimes the merging of the 80s nostalgia and the current day setting, there are certain times when it doesn't mesh quite as well. Maybe it's a little bit too innocent, maybe it's a little bit too naive in its tone, and not understanding that certain things that you did in the 80s you couldn't necessarily get away with now. It kind of almost is like a time capsule of the 80s, and it roots it in the modern day setting without sometimes recognising the certain boundaries and certain settings within the modern day culture that we live in now. Now, that can be to its strength and its detriment, and I think it depends on where you're coming from. If you are a major fan of Cobra Kai and you really appreciate this as a love letter to that original film franchise. You won't really pick up on these details as such, or they won't really affect your overall enjoyment. But I guess if you are somebody new coming into the series, you may question a bit more about, you know, how sometimes certain older characters haven't got to grips yet with social media. They're not very much aware of the internet and its impact amongst the younger generation. Sometimes see Johnny Lawrence starting fights in open shops or open areas, and there's little to no repercussions, whereas we know that definitely wouldn't be the case today, where we very much live in a culture where everything you do, everything you say is put under such a microscope. Certain things that characters do wouldn't get away with in this modern society, and I think maybe sometimes there's a slight conflict between the tone. You certainly do have to go into Cobra Kai suspending a certain amount of disbelief, but again, if you're a major fan of the franchise, you won't really question those moments too much. And I think, to be honest, if you are a new fan coming into this, there is still plenty of heart and soul, as I mentioned before, and chemistry and energy to still feel that you can enjoy this show. In no capacity do you have to watch the original films to be a fan of this show, and that's again a credit to the showrunners, how they understand that you can pay respect and pay reference and pay homage without overburdening the viewer, without alienating any potential new audience. You can create that synergy between the old and the new, and that's what I think makes Cobra Kai such a special show, especially in its first season. So overall, if I had to give a score for the first season of Cobra Kai, I would give it an 8.6 out of 10. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and yes, there was a case of a novelty, and yes, it did exceed expectations, but I think that's a good thing for all shows, and I think there was a fresh dynamic and energy that it retained from the original fan franchise, but at the same time it still provided itself to be very accessible for newer viewers, and it paid enough respect and homage to the original franchise. And I think it's a valuable lesson that I think a lot of recent interpretations and reboots of classic characters could also learn from in the long run. So those are my thoughts and review on the first season of Cobra Kai. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I will shortly provide a review of the second season of the show, and I will make sure I upload that before the third season debuts on Netflix on January the 1st and 2021. So let me know what you think in the comments below. If you've already seen Cobra Kai, as I imagine a lot of you have done since it debuted way back in 2018, let me know what you think, coming forward from a perspective of an original fan of the film franchise, or indeed a newer fan who hasn't seen the original movies. What did you think? Did you enjoy it? How did you think it compares to other recent interpretations or reboots, or other current new shows that are very popular today? So that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.